Ezekiel chapter 28. Ezekiel chapter 28. The last couple of Wednesday nights we looked at Isaiah 14 about the fall of Satan and said we would look at this passage here in Ezekiel 28, which is another passage describing how Satan was before he fell and then his terrible fall. So we're just going to look at these verses here tonight. Ezekiel 28 and the verse 11. It says, Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. Amen. So far, may the Lord just bless that reading to our hearts. This passage, as with the one in Isaiah that we looked at before, has a double fulfillment. One in Ezekiel's own time and also a fulfillment in the past. And this passage is speaking about the king of Tyre, and we see that from verse 12. It says, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, or the king of Tyre. The king of Tyre was a proud, arrogant king, a human king. And Ezekiel was told here to take up a lamentation, or what that phrase really means is sing a funeral song for him. Like the king of Babylon that we saw in Isaiah 14, this king was a powerful world ruler at that time. The nation of Tyre had become a great powerful nation amongst the nations of the world at that time, and obviously the king of Tyre would have been a powerful world ruler during that time. He had been highly exalted. He had held a very high position. In verse 12 it says, Thou sealest up the sum, or that phrase means you were the seal of perfection, or the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So that's describing, and we'll look in a moment or two just some more of the descriptions of this king here. But he was perfect, as it were, when God created him. But like the king of Babylon, because of pride, he had a terrible fall. And we saw whenever we were looking at Isaiah 14 that about the fall of Satan and how pride caused him to fall. You know, the reality that pride, cometh before a fall is a truth that we need to constantly remind ourselves of. Pride will always lead to a fall. And we have its fall there in verse 17, where it says, Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. The fall of this king was so great that it could be thought of as a death. He didn't actually literally physically die, but his fall was so great that it could be likened to a death. And so this is why Ezekiel is told here to take up a lamentation, or or sing a funeral song for him because of this terrible fall that he had. But in the words of this funeral song, the prophet is also speaking to the spiritual ruler behind this earthly ruler. And in this lament for an arrogant human king, God spoke of the sin and the fall of the spiritual ruler who was behind that king, namely Satan himself. So we again have this double fulfillment. He's speaking of this king who was a great, powerful king and who fell because of pride, but he's also speaking of the spiritual power, Satan, who was behind this man, behind this king. And so we have this double fulfillment again. The idea of a prophet speaking to the spiritual ruler or authority behind an earthly ruler is not uncommon in the prophets. That's what was happening in Isaiah 14, the passage we looked at. Daniel 10 is another example. Daniel chapter 10 tells us about the archangel Michael, and he is describing there a battle that he was having with a spiritual enemy, and he called him the Prince of Persia. And chapter 10 of verse 13 of Daniel, it says, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me." So this was obviously a spiritual ruler who was behind the earthly ruler, the Prince of Persia. So it's not unusual for the prophets to do this, to speak of and describe the spiritual ruler who is behind an earthly ruler. From this passage here before us, it seems that as Ezekiel considered the thoughts and the ways of this earthly monarch, the king of Tyre, he could very clearly discern the force that was behind him, motivating and driving him in his opposition to God. In other words, he saw the work and the activity of Satan that the king of Tyre was imitating in so many ways. As we look around in our world even tonight and you see great and powerful people of great influence, and especially great world leaders, and it's very rare to see a godly world leader in these days, isn't it? And so many of them, by their thoughts, by their actions, the things that they're advocating and standing for, we can so clearly discern the spiritual force that is behind them. And the sad reality is that it's these great world leaders who think that they're so great and think that they're so powerful and think that they're doing so well in what they do as they rule their countries and as they rule the world. Yet the reality is, the majority of them, Satan and the powers of darkness are behind them. That force behind them that's motivating them and controlling all that they do. And that's so evident, even in the laws in our own land that are being passed. And this is really what the prophet is speaking of here as he thinks of this powerful world ruler, king of Tyre, and as he observed his thoughts and his actions, he could clearly discern the work of Satan behind him and controlling him and motivating him in what he did. So how does the prophet describe Satan here in this passage before he fell? A number of descriptions here. Look at verse 12. The middle of it says, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. This is the most detailed description of Satan that we will find anywhere in the Bible. It describes his original power and greatness, his wisdom, beauty, his exalted position. He was, as we said earlier, the model of perfection. That's how God created him. That's how powerful and wonderful Satan was whenever God created him. Then in verse 13 it says, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Before he fell, Satan had been there in the Garden of Eden. And we know about the Garden of Eden. It was that wonderful place that God created, that special place that he created. It was perfect in every way. It was special. He placed Adam and Eve in that garden whenever he first made them, and it was just a place of glory and perfection. And that's where Satan was whenever God created him, and he enjoyed all of the beauty and the glory of that place. And then in the second part of verse 13, it says, "Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold." So before he fell, Satan had been adorned with all this glory and splendour. God himself, we're told here, was the one who had covered him with these precious stones. It wasn't that he had adorned himself, but rather God had created him with this special covering, with glory and splendour. Again, this speaks to us of how powerful Satan was when God created him. As if he was the special being that God made. The collection of stones here, this is interesting. The collection of stones that are mentioned here are similar to those on the breastplate of the high priest. And if you want to turn back to Exodus 28 and verse 17, where it tells us the list of the stones that were to be put in the breastplate of the high priest. Exodus 28 and verse 17. It says, "And thou shalt set in it," that's in the breastplate, "thou shalt set in it settings of stones, even 4 rows of stones. The first row shall be a sardius, a topaz, and a carbuncle. This shall be the first row. The second row shall be an emerald, a sapphire, and a diamond. In the third row, a ligure, an agate, and an amethyst. And the fourth row, a beryl, and an onyx, and a jasper." So the list of stones here that were to be put into the breastplate of the high priest are very similar. The list is very similar to these stones that are listed here in this passage that we're looking at. How God covered Satan with these precious stones. So these stones that Satan was adorned with not only speak of the glory and the honour that God created him with and that he had, but they also suggest the idea of being a priest. We don't know anything beyond that, but it would seem like that Satan, when God created him, was acting as some kind of priest in the presence of God, and that was a great honour indeed. It was a great honour in Israel for someone to be chosen as the high priest to represent the people to God, and it was a great honour for Satan to have had this position of being a priest. Then in the second or the last part of verse 13, it says, "The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created." So these are a reference to musical instruments. And this suggests that whenever Satan was created, he was very musical. He had music in him. You know, there are some people and it just seems like music is in them. The rest of us just have to sit back and let our jealousy be tested. But it's wonderful to see someone, it's amazing, someone just seems to have music in them. They can sit down and they can play anything and it just seems to come so naturally to them. Well, that's how Satan was, it would seem, that he was created with music in him. Before his fall, he had a significant role in the music of heaven, the music that surrounds the throne of God. In the book of Revelation, we are told that songs of worship are sung continually before God's throne. And it would seem that Satan was the worship leader there in heaven, leading those songs of worship. And this is why Satan today knows how to use music to incite rebellion against God. And we see that, especially the last few decades, that music, and there's all different types of music, but Satan knows how to use music, how to pervert good music, and through that music and through lyrics that are sung to that music, and a lot of stuff that really is not good. It's really against God, and it really is anti-God, and Satan knows how to use that even in the lives of our young people. And I believe that it's because Satan was created with music in him, and now that he's a fallen creature, and his work is to turn people against God, he knows how to use music to do that, and is very successful in doing that. Verse 14 then says, "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth." This tells us that Satan was one of the privileged angelic beings who surrounded the throne of God. And these privileged angels were known as the cherubim. And he wasn't just simply one cherubim among many. It says he was the anointed one, or the specially chosen one. He may even have been the chief guardian of the throne of God. He was the specially chosen cherubim. And it says there in verse 14 that "I have set thee so," or established you. Satan had the privilege of being established by God in this very privileged position. It wasn't that he personally was ambitious of this position and strove until he got it, but rather God was the one who gave it to him, the position of being the chief guardian there of the throne of God. So again, this is all showing us how powerful a being Satan was, how great he was when God created him. In the second part of verse 14, it says, "I have set thee so that thou wast upon the holy mountain of God." The holy mountain of God is a reference to the heavenly Mount Zion. Hebrews 12 and 22, it says, "But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels." The earthly Mount Zion, where there's a number of references, especially in the Psalms, to the earthly Mount Zion. It was there in Jerusalem. It was the special dwelling place of God, a special place where God met with his people. And the earthly Mount Zion there in the city of Jerusalem is just a picture of this heavenly Mount Zion, the dwelling place of God. Again, this shows us the very privileged place that Satan had whenever God created him. He was in the very dwelling place of God himself. He was in the very same place as God. In that privileged place, he had great freedom of movement, because we're told there at the end of verse 14, "Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire." So he walked back and forth among fiery stones. These fiery stones are probably a description of the angelic beings who are known as the seraphim. We have a reference to those if you want to turn back to Isaiah chapter 6 and the verse 2. This is a well-known passage of Isaiah's vision of the Lord on his throne. But chapter 6 of Isaiah and the verse 1, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly." So Isaiah makes a reference here to the seraphim. He had this wonderful vision of the throne of God, seeing God upon his throne, high and lifted up. But these seraphim, these, again, special angels, were surrounding the throne of God. And so again, they were told here in our passage that Satan walked up and down amongst these special angels before the throne of God. So Satan had, again, a wonderful privilege given to him by God, a wonderful place there, even in heaven. Verse 15, it says, "Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee." So Satan was perfect. He enjoyed perfection there in heaven, in that place of great status and honor that God had made him with. But then something happened. And it's really incredible as we think of this, a being so near to God, such splendour and glory that God made him with, such a place of status and honour that he had, perfect in his ways, we're told, until iniquity was found in him. Note it says that it was found in him. God didn't place it there. God had created him good and perfect, but he ended up twisting and perverting that good and perfect nature that God had made him with and that God had created him with. And what was Satan's iniquity? This iniquity that was found in him. Verse 16, it says, by the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. So what was Satan's iniquity? Again, thinking of the king of Tyre, the nation of Tyre was known for its trading. They were great in a big way into trading goods and so on. And because Satan and the king of Tyre are both being referred to here in this passage, Satan's sins are described in the same terms as the sins of Tyre. Tyre was a highly commercialized city-state, and their only focus in doing trade was to make a profit. And so they had a very competitive spirit. We know plenty of people like that, don't we? Whenever people are set on making profit, even with their business and so on, they tend to have a very competitive spirit. And that's exactly the sin that was found in Satan. We looked at it in Isaiah 14. He had a highly competitive spirit. He was wanting to exalt himself above his peers. He didn't want anyone else to be above him, but rather he wanted to be above everyone else. So there's this competitive spirit. And it says there in verse 16, by the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence. Tyre did a lot of trading, but there was a lot of deceptive and dishonest business practices that went on. And sadly, things haven't changed even in our world today. And in the business world, those of you who are in the business world, you will know that there's a lot of deceptive and dishonest business practices that go on. There's probably not a business that doesn't have it to some degree or not or other. And so this is a perfect picture here of the dishonest, deceptive dealings of the spiritual power that was behind them. That was Satan himself. You know, Satan is described as the father of lies, the one who has come to steal, to kill, and to destroy. He's the master deceiver. And that's something that we need to constantly remind ourselves of as we constantly face the Satan's opposition in our lives, as we face his attacks upon us. We must never forget that he is a master deceiver. Just like business people can, in their crookedness, can be so deceptive as they want to make profit and make gain for themselves, Satan is a master deceiver. And how subtle he is in the way he comes with his temptations against us. As we saw before, he's like an angel of light. He deceives us so cunningly. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's a master at what he does in the art of deception. It says there, they have filled the midst of thee with violence. Satan's desire to exalt himself there in heaven led to some kind of violence. And Revelation 12 talks about a battle in heaven at the time that Satan was thrown out. Verse 16 then says, and therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God. I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. So Satan's sin was triggered by pride. he had a swollen heart. He was filled with a sense of his own beauty and his own splendour. And that's why he then opposed God and rebelled against him. And that's a sin that we need to so guard ourselves against. It's so easy to become filled with a sense of ourselves, our own importance, what we think we have, even gifts and talents and abilities that we have. It's so easy to become filled with a sense of ourselves and think that we are something, that we can do something. 1 Peter 5 and verse 5, it says, God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. And God will always resist the proud. And he resisted Satan here at the beginning whenever pride came in. And we're told here that he cast him as profane out of the mountain of God. There he was on the mountain of God, in the very presence of God, with all of his beauty and glory and splendour. And yet when pride came in, God had to cast him as something profane, something unclean, out of his presence and out of the mountain of God. What a fall, and how low pride can lay any one of us. And we've all seen sad examples of people around us that filled with pride, and yet that pride has brought them so low. And may God help us. May God give us a holy hatred of pride. May we always guard ourselves against it in all its subtle forms, and how it will come against us. And if it could lay Satan so low, who had been created so high and so exalted, then how much more can it lay us low, who are much less than what Satan was created as. So may God help us. May God strengthen us in our battle against pride, against the deception of Satan and all his ways in which he comes against us. May God enable us to stand strong against him and to stand strong for the Lord. That's why we need to be praying, folks, praying for each other, that God would help us and strengthen us as we face these things. So